I'll show you my approach to speed painting tanks. While I may not possess the most refined or stylized painting skills, I have honed a method that allows me to efficiently complete extensive Horus Heresy armies. Throughout this guide, I will outline straightforward processes that are accessible to all, regardless of painting proficiency or specific legion of choice. We will be using Imperial fists from our Siege of Chthoniya campaign as our example. It's a common sight to witness hobbyists assembling their tanks entirely, according to the instructions before applying any paint. However, this approach significantly extends the painting process, as it necessitates either masking the tracks and weapons or meticulously painting them after the vehicle's base color has been applied. Personally, I opt for a different strategy, assembling the tank only as much as necessary. I leave the tracks, sponsons, hull-mounted weapons, and other details off the tank. This affords me greater flexibility in base coating the chassis and enables me to spray the tracks with lead belcher while they are still on the sprue. Later, I can easily glue them onto the already painted chassis. This method saves a considerable amount of time while maintaining quality results. First, prime the areas intended to be yellow with Wraithbone spray. I use Wraithbone over white to give a warmer tone to the yellow, which will come later. The track sprues and other small parts, which will be gunmetal color, are sprayed with lead belcher spray. The parts intended to be black are primed with Chaos Black spray. After the priming, I then add the yellow base layer by spraying Vallejo Air Sun Yellow over the Wraithbone. After getting the base colors on, I move to striping. For both the Land Raider and the Vindicators, I chose to do stripes similar to the Games Workshop box art. For finer striping, I start with a thin masking tape to draw the lines and then use regular blue masking tape to protect the rest of the tank from overspray. For more general striping, like on the Vindicators, I use regular blue masking tape only. To draw the lines, I usually try and connect rivets or lines in the paneling because it makes the striping more repeatable, which will ensure consistency, which is important not only to make sure both sides of the tank are symmetrical, but also that entire tanks and squadrons match. The striped areas are airbrushed with Vallejo Air Black. Followed by a light spray of Vallejo Air Anthracite Gray. While the Vallejo Air Anthracite Gray is in the airbrush, I also apply it to the black panels and dozer blades for the Vindicators. When the paint is dry, carefully peel off the masking tape. With masking, there is always some cleanup. I use Citadel Ushabti Bone to touch up the areas where the striping bled through. I follow that with a layer of Vallejo Sun Yellow. Don't worry if your cleanup marks are slightly visible. They will be blended later with weathering. I then glue the sides of the Land Raider to the chassis and touch up around the assault ramp. Next, I airbrush a light layer of Seraphim Sepia shade onto the tank. This will add a slight gradient to the yellow and help blend the touched up areas around the striping. Be careful not to apply the shade too heavy as it will pool. It's now time to apply the main transfers to the vehicles. For the Land Raider, I went with the bold black fists, off the Forge World sheet like the box art, and on the Vindicators, I went with the more traditional Imperial fists emblem from the standard vehicle transfer sheet. When applying transfer sheets to vehicles, look for lines or design elements on the tank to index off of to straighten and line up the transfer. This is important for symmetry and ensuring your transfer is straight. I often use my hobby knife to draw a line or act as a ruler when lining my transfers up. When your transfers are dried onto the tank, I use Walther's Solva set to set them. This is essential if adding transfers to rounded or uneven surfaces. Next, I move on to the small parts. I paint the brass areas of the Executioner Plasma Destroyer with Citadel Rune Lord brass. I'm guilty of committing the sin of drawing paint straight out of the pot. I then do a light dry brush of Citadel Retributor armor. I switch over to Citadel Ironbreaker and do a lighter dry brush on the brass areas and clean up any areas where the brass color may have spilt onto the silver. Still using Citadel Ironbreaker, I move on to painting the silver areas of the Predator turret and vehicle chassis. Then it's time to glue on the gun barrels and other parts that were pre-primed lead belcher spray. Moving on to the small details, I paint the viewing ports first with a layer of Citadel Caliban green, followed by a light highlight of Citadel Warboss green. Then use Citadel Wordbearer's red to dot the Auspex lens. I follow this with a tiny highlight of Citadel Mephiston red. I apply a light sponge weather using Ushabti bone. I apply this over both the yellow surfaces and the black striping. It gives the illusion of small paint chips and again, further blends in the touch-up areas on the striping. I do another sponge weather on the black parts with Citadel Eshin Gray. I then move to applying a generous coat of Nuln oil shade to all of the iron breaker and bronze metallic areas of the vehicles. I also do a Nuln oil wash over the Auspex lenses and viewing ports. I move on to a second sponge weather over the vehicle using iron breaker. I apply a slightly lighter amount than the previous Ushabti bone sponge weather. I focus on the edges of armor plates and areas that would have the most wear and tear, like the edges of the assault ramps, doors, and areas of the tank that border the tracks. Speaking of tracks, I clip off the pre-sprayed tracks off their sprues to glue them onto the chassis. I use my hobby knife to clean up the areas where I clipped them. Make sure you look at your instruction sheet to verify the track direction. Nothing more frustrating than gluing tracks onto a tank and having to tear them off and reverse them. Clip off and glue on the other small lead belcher parts. Now it's time to paint the center line and penal weapons. I usually start with painting all of the black areas with Citadel Abaddon black. I then move to Iron Breaker. I paint the silver areas of the bolter and touch up any brush slips on the las cannons. I paint the brass coils of the las cannons in the same manner as the Executioner Plasma Destroyer. I apply a light highlight to the black areas with Citadel Eshin Gray. After gluing the bolters onto the chassis, I do the red Auspex lenses, followed by a Nuln oil shade wash over the entire bolter. I wash the entire las cannon assembly and let it dry. Now, I then glue the black armor panels and dozers onto the Vindicators. Painting the exhaust stacks used to be my least favorite part of painting any Space Marine tank. Getting the brush in all the exhaust holes was always a pain. Here's a trick that makes it much quicker and less tortuous. I wrap the stack in a paper towel, leaving only the upper part of the stack exposed. I spray the upper stack with lead belcher spray. The lead belcher spray covers about 80% of the stack and speeds up the painting process tremendously. The lead belcher spray is also noticeably darker than the Iron Breaker Citadel paint, so when you finish the lower sections and last 20% of the stack, the result has a nice worn look to it. I finish the stacks with a full wash of Citadel Nuln oil shade. Once the stacks are dry, I glue them onto the tanks and then repeat my sponge weathering of Citadel Ushabti Bone and Citadel Iron Breaker. Aside from the lack of sponson weapons, our tanks are now starting to look pretty good. To do the sponsons, I keep the main components in sub-assemblies and spray the silver components with lead belcher spray and the black components with Chaos Black spray. On the black parts, I repeat a light airbrush of Vallejo Air Anthracite. I then repeat the same process as the pintle, turret, and centerline weapons. Let's jump into the weathering stage. It's important to seal your vehicles prior to weathering because without it, the oils and powders will pool around the edges of your transfers. My sealant of choice is Tester's Dull Coat. It grants a nice even finish, and out of thousands of models sealed, I have never had any frosting or inconsistency. After the models are sealed, I prepare to do oils. I'm using Abteilung oils and odorless thinner. Because we are painting Imperial fists, I'm going to use the dark mud oil first, and if needed, blend in their earth oil. I'm starting darker because I want it to have contrast with the bright yellow. I use a peanut butter cup tray as my palette. One side is predominantly thinner, and the other has a few dabs of oil. Using an old brush, I do a very light dab of oil and then thin it with the thinner. I then pin wash the tanks, focusing on rivets and edges of armor plates. If you go overboard with your oils, you can always come back and brush the oils out with thinner. Many people intentionally go a little thicker in areas and then draw downward with thinner to create the effect of rust or grime lines coming down the side of the vehicle. Once you are happy with your oils and they are dry, I use weathering powders to powder the tracks and other areas of the vehicle that would collect dirt and dust in a realistic setting. I don't worry about going heavy in these areas as the powders will get toned down when the vehicle is sealed again. I tend to focus on the lower portions of the tanks, but often do some lighter powdering on the top of the vehicle to give it a light effect. After powders, I then seal the vehicle again in Tester's dull coat. This tones down some of the powders and fixes it all in place. These tanks are game pieces after all, and I don't want my powders falling off or the models being prone to finger marks from gameplay. For the final stage, I do a light airbrushing of Vallejo air cement around the tracks and lower areas of the tanks. This creates a look of newly added dust. I use Vallejo air black around the barrels of the Vindicators. Our tanks are finished and ready to be deployed to the battlefields of Chthoniya. Thank you for watching if you made it this far, and please stay tuned for our upcoming Siege of Chthoniya campaign series. If there are any models or units you would like to see me paint, please let me know in the comments.